Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stephen Booth. I lead the Britain in the World project here at Policy Exchange. Today I'm delighted to welcome Christopher Luxon, the New Zealand leader of the opposition and leader of the National Party. Christopher is the MP for Botany. He entered Parliament at the 2020 election and was elected leader of the National Party in November 2021. Prior to entering Parliament, he was Chief Executive Officer of Air New Zealand from 2013 to 2019. And in that capacity, he served as the inaugural chair of Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's Business Advisory Council and has received wide recognition for his leadership roles, including a Blake Leader Award, Deloitte CEO of the Year, Orient Aviation Person of the Year, and Deloitte Company of the Year. First of all, Christopher is going to make some opening remarks. After that, there will be an opportunity to ask some questions. We'll have a discussion from the seated area. So please do think of some questions and try and catch my eye, and I'll come to you shortly. But first of all, it's my pleasure to welcome Christopher.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Well, kia ora koutou, everybody. Good afternoon and special greetings from New Zealand. I've just come from a trip to Singapore and also through Dublin, and mistakenly on Saturday gave Leo Varadkar a signed All Black rugby ball, which was a bit insensitive, I suspect, given the recent hammering of the Irish by the All Blacks back down in New Zealand. Of course, here I arrive in London this morning, and I can tell you there will be no sporting or gloating given the recent hammering that we've taken from the English cricket team. All I would say to you is it's wonderful that my good friend Brendan McCullum is your coach, and that you've got a great Kiwi-born, ultra-competitive captain in Ben Stokes, and it's just good to see Kiwi exports doing it for England as a result. So I do want to put sports aside because I could go on about it all day, but I am really pleased to be now here in London, and I want to say thank you for having me here at the Policy Exchange. It's a real privilege to be here and to be able to get into a discussion with you. What a good name, I'd say, Policy Exchange is, because no one has a monopoly on good ideas, and least of all those that actually think that they do. And all of us have a great deal to learn about making good policy, especially on behalf of the most disadvantaged people in our societies. And I'm delighted today to share with you my thoughts as leader of New Zealand's largest opposition party in Parliament, the New Zealand National Party. And I want to talk a bit about the importance of not using the current economic upheaval or the war in Ukraine as reasons to start putting up barriers that took so long to dismantle. And when we know that globalization has given so many countries of the world economic growth that has lifted billions of people out of poverty and enabled higher living standards, there's just frankly too much to lose by becoming insular. It's particularly important to small countries like New Zealand, which may throw its weight around in an all-black front row, but frankly has to work alongside others in multilateral forums to find heft. And I also want to talk about what we should do with that wealth once we've earned it to support those at the tough end of inequality measures. The capacity of the state to make interventions is vast, yet its results are often poor. A government that I lead will care about those at the bottom, and by caring I don't mean just saying, we spent X billion dollars on welfare. We need to be much better than that. Caring is not just about spending, caring is about getting better outcomes and better results for our people. Now, New Zealand is roughly similar in size to the United Kingdom in area, but has a population of just over 5 million people. We're a modern, multicultural country with a small but advanced economy. Auckland, where I live, is home to people from around 30 different Pacific Island communities. It's the biggest Polynesian city in the world, and some of the smaller Pacific nations, like say Niue, have a far more of their population living in New Zealand than they actually do in Niue itself. And as always, the generalisations about a place don't tell the full story. New Zealand is generally considered to have better race relations than some other countries, and while that is true, I hope New Zealanders would be the first to admit that as a nation we still have a way to go. Likewise, New Zealand is considered pretty clean and green. However, we also have a very long list of native bird species that are considered nationally critical, nationally endangered, or nationally vulnerable. And our native flora and fauna are succumb to introduced pests. And the situation, frankly, is not helped by the design fault in some of our native birds, like the kiwi itself, which is unable to fly. We're also a well-off country by international standards, but our productivity is relatively poor, and our levels of poverty are simply too high. New Zealand was the first country in the world to give women the vote, but there's still a significant gender pay gap. And so it's a great little country, but it could be even better. And we need to work on raising wealth and incomes, and we need to understand more about why, in a time of acute labour shortages, we still have so many people on long-term welfare. What's unarguable is that New Zealand is geographically remote. It's a 3-hour flight from New Zealand to the east coast of Australia, where New Zealanders take advantage of the close relationship with our nearest neighbour to live and to work there. Kiwi birds may not be able to fly, but Kiwi people certainly can, and they do. And while there are 5 million of us living back at home, there are a million of us or more living overseas. And I was, for 16 years, one of them as an expatriate working for Unilever until I came home in 2011 to become Chief Executive of Air New Zealand. So I know firsthand about the Kiwi diaspora. Now, the importance of breaking down barriers can be seen in New Zealand's recent past. For much of New Zealand's post-colonial history, its primary export focus was being Britain's farm. For a time, that worked well for New Zealand and also for Britain. Britain had unfettered supplies of New Zealand's high-quality wool and meat, and New Zealand had a guaranteed customer. And then Britain joined the EEC, and we were cut off. And it was like throwing a teenager out of home, and overnight, New Zealand had to learn to fend for itself. And over time we did, and very successfully, but our economic ousting felt somewhat unjust. Now, New Zealand eventually figured it out and how to recover, and in the 1980s we went further than any other country, and we completely deregulated large swathes of our economy. We got rid of agricultural subsidies, and we still tend to speak with derision about the subsidies that an EU cow attracts. Our agricultural sector became arguably the most efficient in the world. Even with the costs imposed by our distance from our main markets, our efficient production meant we could compete, even with tariffs imposed on our exports. And as a result, New Zealanders now have a strong sense of the importance of free markets. Even our farmers don't like subsidies anymore because it makes them vulnerable to political lobbying. And so New Zealand is almost a free trade purist, asking only for the protection provided by rules, but not for the protection provided by subsidies. We ask only for a level playing field created by regulatory environments that allow businesses to get on with what they do best. And on a level playing field, we can compete. Now, right now, the world is experiencing a period of significant disruption to global economic relationships that I think risks a return to more protectionism. And in particular, since early 2020, there has been a huge disruption to trade caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. For a country as dependent on trade as New Zealand, this is obviously a significant problem, but one that we have little ability to influence. On top of the pandemic, the horror of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the blockading of its ports, alongside sanctions on Russia itself, have created fear in Europe and around the world and have wreaked havoc on global food supplies. Here in the UK, all of this is happening as you continue to extricate yourselves from the European Union. Although it must be remembered that the remaining barriers to trade with Europe are political, and Europe has chosen them. They are not natural or unavoidable. There is a growing sense from many, especially from those who never liked globalization in the first place, that it has run its course, and I disagree. Sure, it's bumpy right now, but a pandemic is, touch wood, a 1 in a 100-year event, and most of the world is coming through it remarkably well, considering how drastic various countries' lockdowns were. Globalization has delivered, and it's not been winner takes all. Apart from lifting 1 billion people out of poverty in the past 20 years, the child mortality rate in both the less developed and the least developed countries has halved. Globally, the share of people living in extreme poverty has been declining for 2 centuries, and in the last 20 years, this trend has been even faster than before, regardless of which poverty measure is actually used. Are some of these gains at risk? I'd argue that the world can overcome the ill effects of the pandemic, so long as, once it's over, countries don't throw out the economic reforms and the openness that made the gains possible in the first place. New Zealand, like the UK and others, has some significant economic issues with inflation and interest rates both rising very quickly. But by and large, the world has been able to weather the headwinds precisely because countries have flexibility to shift supply chains, to find new markets, and to adjust and to trade with one another. There's a real risk right now that we learn the wrong lessons from the recent dislocation. Even if geopolitical alliances change as a result of COVID or of the war in Ukraine, the principles of the benefits of openness will remain. Countries like the UK and New Zealand need to champion the benefits of globalisation. And the promise of Brexit was that the UK, once freed from the shackles of a naturally protectionist EU, would reclaim its mantle as the champion of free trade, of open markets and of global cooperation. And if National wins next year's general election in New Zealand, the government I lead would be pleased to support the UK if it chooses to take on that role. I think all countries have felt that instinct to batten down in the face of adversity. We certainly did it in New Zealand during COVID. The government shut the country's borders, even to many New Zealand citizens who were locked out while their parents died, siblings got married, or visas expired, in whichever country Kiwis happened to be in when the borders shut. And you could come into New Zealand only if you had a booking in a government-run quarantine centre. But the system couldn't cope with demand, and so a virtual lottery, literally a lottery, began to get a place in quarantine. And without that place, you couldn't book a ticket home. And there's a Robert Frost poem with the line, "Home is the place where when you have to go there, they have to take you in." But Robert Frost didn't know the New Zealand government. Because New Zealand didn't take people in, even if they needed to go home. And it was a graphic example of shutting the shop as I can think of. And it was done in the name of protecting New Zealanders by allowing time for our population to get vaccinated after what was a slow vaccine rollout. And the problem was the compulsory quarantine system continued well after COVID was circulating in New Zealand, at which point quarantine was simply absurd, I would even say cruel. And it interested me because public opinion indicated that for some time, many New Zealanders didn't mind that their fellow New Zealanders were being shut out. And it was only as a result of individual stories of hardship and emotional distress that were aired nightly on our TV news, and well after the policy could long be justified, that public pressure really grew and the government gradually dismantled the system. So in the face of me having said to you earlier that New Zealanders support free trade and openness, we had a graphic illustration of how quickly the mood can change and how defensive we can all become. When people think it's in their own interest to keep the world out and politicians can see political advantage in doing so, then mind you, don't get your fingers caught as the shutters slam down. However, I also think that now most New Zealanders would acknowledge that it is openness, mutually beneficial trade, cooperation, and yes, a bit of old-fashioned competition that are now needed. They worked before and they will work again. New Zealand is actually suffering from a productivity disease, and we are going backwards relative to other countries. In the 1950s, to give you a feel for it, New Zealand's GDP per capita was 125% of the OECD average. Today, New Zealand per capita income is less than the OECD average. Between 1970 and 1920, New Zealand's GDP per hour worked fell from 89% of Australia's to 76%, from 101% of the UK to 69%, and from 71% of the US to 58% today. And today, the average Kiwi earns in 1 hour what an Australian earns in 45 minutes. So to grow the economy, New Zealanders had to rely on increasing population and employment and by working longer hours. And the average Kiwi now works 370 hours a year more than someone in the UK, the equivalent of more than 9 extra weeks, and still our incomes lag. So we have low capital per worker, we have low public and private spending on research and development, and we have close to the lowest trade intensity amongst comparably sized countries. Our sclerotic productivity is also unusually persistent. Another aspect of the New Zealand productivity story is the gap between the most and the least productive businesses, because firms in the top decile are around 7 times more productive than those in the lowest decile, a wider gap than what you'd see in most countries around the world. So in short, we're undercapitalised, we're over-regulated and isolated in more ways than just geographical. And productivity comes from governments being absolutely clear about their role and executing that role well via prudent fiscal policy, public services that actually work, infrastructure where and when it's needed, being willing to cut red tape and abolish wasteful spending. And productivity also requires competition, because competition is crucial, especially for small countries which can only access the benefits of deep markets via trade and investment. So I want to take you through what we call National's 5-point plan to lift productivity. First, we need an education system that works. Our government is spending $5 billion more on education, only to have a staggering 40% of our kids not regularly attending school. And this isn't just a social failure, this is a moral failure, and it's an economic crisis in the making. We need kids at schools, and we need schools that teach every child to read and write. And it's why this morning, upon my first visit upon landing, I went straight to the Michaela School to spend some time with Catherine, because they're doing an excellent job of making sure they teach kids to be numerate and literate as they go forward. Second, we're going to solve New Zealand's persistent underinvestment in infrastructure by fixing the funding and the governance bottlenecks and getting capital to where it can add value. And third, we need to really up our game on technology to lift productivity, because New Zealand firms are measurably far from the technology frontier relative to other countries. And we need to remove the barriers preventing our businesses accessing capital so that ideas so that more of our small businesses can actually achieve a global scale. Fourth, we'll give businesses a predictable and a consistent regulatory environment. We're going to take a rules-based approach because we know that that supports investment, and New Zealand must compete for its capital. And finally, we will build our connections with the world stronger than they were before, because more trade, more investment, both ways, and greater immigration will help build our workforce even further. Now, doing these things well will lift our economic performance, but that is not an end in itself. A stronger economy is an enabler, and a government that I lead wants to see wealth and incomes increase. A government has a moral, a social, and a financial imperative to lift up its most disadvantaged citizens, and I absolutely believe that we can do that in New Zealand. New Zealand has the complexity of countries like the US and the UK, but on a much smaller scale. We are small enough to identify our problems, to name them, to wrestle with them, and ultimately conquer them. We have, I believe, the potential to find solutions that have eluded other countries as they grapple with entrenched disadvantage. As I said, New Zealand is a great little country and a progressive one, and we have achieved many things that we are incredibly proud of. But like every Western country, we have a strata of our society who, despite universal access to health and education, sees no way of making social or economic traction. Theirs is often an intergenerational malaise, and it doesn't have to be that way. Using data to pinpoint when and where and with whom to intervene to try and change the otherwise poor course of someone's life is a process that has become known in New Zealand as social investment. And it was introduced by a previous national government which used the example of 5-year-olds in state care. In 2015, New Zealand had 1,500 children in state care, and the government knew from drilling into that data that by the time those kids were 35 years old, their welfare costs would have been around $550 million. And when you can see how the trajectories of those lives will unfold, as a government, you must try to alter that course on behalf of the people themselves and their families and their communities. And similarly, data showed that without intervention, a teenager on a sole parent benefit would likely be on a benefit for around 20 years. And that provoked significant changes so that teen parents were no longer handed cash and ignored. Instead, their rent and utilities were paid, and the government helped look after their children so they could train as part of a plan for their lives that was not about welfare dependency. We saw results, but unfortunately the Labour government back home has turned away from social investment, and a national government I lead will be bringing it back. Social investment isn't about the government having all the answers, because the three actors in our society, government, business and community, have to work together on our big problems and our huge opportunities. But government is a significant actor in the scene. It holds the purse strings, and in my view it has the moral responsibility to produce better long-term outcomes. Not just to spend money, because how much you spend is regularly often used as a proxy for how much you care, but to actually change people's lives and their prospects by helping them do more for themselves. And as I said at the start, no one has a monopoly on good ideas, but governments working alone or alongside other community providers can achieve more. And I sincerely believe that, and it certainly motivates me. COVID showed us that when we put our minds to it, each country can come up with bold actions to solve problems. And in particular, centre-right parties that believe in an equality of opportunity must do much more to strengthen the rungs on the ladder of social mobility so that people, regardless of their circumstances, get a shot at what we call back home the Kiwi dream. So ladies and gentlemen, it would be easy to look at the world right now, to be scared and retreat. That will solve nothing. The lesson of COVID is that when the public can see that drastic measures are required to solve a real life problem, they will accept those measures. And I hope, as do we all, that the threat of COVID is passing. But plenty of other problems remain, and we can tackle them, and we can succeed. As nations, we need to preserve the open, rules-based system that has stimulated and supported economic growth, and that provides fairness to small countries. As societies, we need to have the courage and the conviction to tackle our hardest problems. There are solutions. Government can use innovation, it can use data, and it should use their power and influence to provide hope and demonstrable progress for those at the hard end of inequality. What in the end could be more uplifting and satisfying in government than doing just that? So I want to say thank you to the Policy Exchange for allowing me to share my views. All of us are living in unsettled times, and navigating this period does require real leadership to hold firm to a course that will aid recovery and prosperity. And I hope that the UK will continue to champion the policies and principles of openness, and under a national government we will do the same in New Zealand so that Kiwis can in fact continue to fly. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Just to say, if you are joining us remotely and you'd like to ask a question, please do raise your virtual hand, and I will try to come to you in a few moments. And likewise, if you're in the audience, please do try and catch my eye. And I will start off by asking a few questions, if that's okay, based on your remarks and also what's going on in the world today. I mean, you mentioned, for example, that you'd like to sort of welcome the UK in its role of leading the argument for free trade. I think today our Trade Secretary is in Parliament discussing the sort of agreement in principle with New Zealand and also with Australia. Those are the first deals that the UK has done sort of independently, truly novel deals outside of the EU. And the UK debate has been kind of dominated by this question of have we gone too far in terms of liberalisation. There's a lot of talk from the farming lobby, for example, about concerns around new competition from the likes of New Zealand and Australia. Others would say that we haven't gone far enough and we haven't demonstrated our credentials. How do you think the UK has done in the first instance? Well, I guess the other question from a UK point of view is, how do you make the argument? You say that New Zealand went through that process of diversification away from the UK, but also liberalisation, and obviously it's hugely dependent on trade. And for those who argue the UK needs to go further in that direction, what are the arguments that you think those people need to make?
Well, look, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is that I think with respect to the Australian and the New Zealand deals, I think they've been very good, high-quality deals for both countries. And I think the way that Britain came out post-Brexit with a massive determination to actually engage with free trade and to want to go through and build those deals with Australia and New Zealand was actually very admirable, I thought, in my view. What I'd say to you is that we sit at the end of the world in a country the size of Great Britain, but actually with 5 million people, and so we don't get rich selling stuff to each other within New Zealand. We get rich by going out in the world to 7.8 billion people in 195 countries, and we've learnt that that's actually how we drive our economy going forward. And so that has been a journey, as you heard, from the 1970s when we left the EEC, and then some more deregulation through the 80s. So in New Zealand, I think there's a strong understanding and a recognition that that's actually what we need to do. Our challenges are slightly different in the sense of we've had a big free trade agreement with China. We were the first in the world to do so, and it's provided huge economic value to our economy as a result. But the challenge is that New Zealand businesses have got comfortable operating in that market and have learnt to operate in it, and we need to continue to diversify our trade. And so business leaders, like I used to be, need to be thinking much more about Southeast Asia and Indonesia and places where we're chronically under trade. Big opportunities here, obviously, in the UK. It was interesting to see. I thought the UK and Australia did an exceptionally good job negotiating even early harvest agreements. Very, very limited agreements, I guess, with India. And actually, my frustration has been that New Zealand has been playing a pretty small, a very inward, a very negative, a very wet game, and not been out actually engaging with the world and doing trade and hustling in the way that we want to be doing so. So my view is that I think part of it is selling the why to the people. In our case, New Zealand is pretty simple. We're in a geographically isolated place. We have to get rich trading with others. And I think you'd build that case, pretty strongly with the British people here as well.
And you also mentioned, it's hard to ignore the geopolitical situation, and you mentioned sort of the reliance or degree of integration with China. I think given sort of the war in Ukraine, the focus mines particularly in the Indo-Pacific region on the question of around Taiwan, for example, and China's growing influence in the region. You've seen sort of various initiatives aimed at potentially kind of seeking to rebalance the power in that area. You've got AUKUS, for example, which New Zealand isn't a part of. Are there areas where you think that New Zealand might be more engaged in those kind of questions? And I guess the other question from a sort of UK perspective is what more, if anything, can the UK do to help its allies in the region in terms of those discussions?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing I'd say is that it's become an increasingly complex and ambiguous and uncertain world, and you can be very simplistic about that rather than simple. And actually, we have to work through quite a lot of complexity, all of us, I think, in the world. With respect to China, our position's pretty clear. We have an independent foreign policy. We believe very strongly in nation state and sovereignty, which is why we've got various, alongside the Brits and taken a good set of interventions around the Ukraine. And we believe in international rules and law. And so those are principles that guide us. Having said that, it doesn't preclude us from having, we've been having it's a 50-year relationship with China that we've had. And that means that we actually can raise these issues of difference as well as the issues where we have common interests, but we do that always with great respect. What I'd say is the challenge that we have is that we have alignment with liberal democracy and values very strongly, but we have no access to markets commercially in the US, for example. And that's been a real source of tension, and often with a US presence that's come in and out of the Pacific at times. And I think over the last 5 years, Britain's done an exceptionally good job of even opening up more bases, more embassies and presences across the Pacific as well, and through Polynesian Pacific Island nation states. And so that's been really good to see that level of engagement as well. So I think the danger is we can simplify things and we can be simplistic, and we actually need to understand it's a lot of complexity to manage, but we will always act in our own interests with an independent policy, align with those that have similar values to us where it makes sense and where we have good alignment, but also be comfortable raising concerns with our partners and doing so always with great respect.
Okay, thank you. Question there from a colleague in the second row.
Thank you so much for your...
Can you say your name and where you're from, just so I got a sense of...
My name is Benjamin Barnard.
G'day, Benjamin.
I'm from Policy Exchange, and one of the things we've done, put a lot of work on at Policy Exchange, is about reform of government and how to make it better. And we had a Reform of Government Commission, which actually featured your former House of Representatives Speaker, Sir Lockwood Smith.
Yes.
And one of the questions I was going to ask you is basically what you think we can learn from New Zealand to try and make our government more efficient and better, and whether you have any plans in opposition that you're developing to reform the machinery of government in New Zealand to allow it to enable all of the changes you've outlined today.
Yeah, well, what I'd say to you is I think we were an exemplar on public service, but I'd say to you, sadly, we are not today. In the last 4 years under this Labour government, we've added 14,000 more bureaucrats into Wellington. And it's into bureaucracy and it's into middle management. It's not in frontline services and teachers or nurses or anything like that. And so on this trip, one of my motivations is I've gone to Singapore as the first place, and then on to Ireland, and then here to the UK. And I'm wanting to get good ideas from each of those places, because there are things that each of those other, and UK accepted, those small advanced economies do very well. But in Singapore, it was really around infrastructure planning, which is one of the big 5 drivers of what drives prosperity and ultimately productivity. But the second thing I really wanted to understand was to spend time with the chief civil servant to really understand how they have got probably the world's best and most effective public service going. And I think my takeaway is they are very intentional with it. They develop talent in the public service, but what they are ruthlessly clear about is targets accountability and transparency of measurement. And I think we could perpetually restructure the New Zealand's public service, but I think that's what we've got to put back into place to get to a much more efficient and a more effective place. The problem in New Zealand is it's all lovely spin, but we're not getting any action. It's, there's no delivery, there's a lot of activity, but no achievement, and they are two very, very different concepts. And so when you spend $5 billion more on education, you add 1,500 people into the Ministry of Education, and yet you only have 60% of your kids having regular school attendance, which is a horrific stat. And we also have been slipping on maths, reading and science scores versus our own history, but versus our other competitive peer countries. That's a big problem. When you spend $8 billion more on social welfare, you put another 2,500 bureaucrats into the centralisation of the head office, and you end up in a place where we have 3.2% unemployment, but 53,000 more people on long-term, on job benefits. There's something going wrong. If you can't move people from welfare into work now and do so to support them doing so and do that well, when will you do it? So just trying to give you a bit of context, it has moved on where we actually are very frustrated with the delivery and the outcomes of our public service. And outcomes matter, right? I mean, outcomes is how you transform people's daily lives. So that's what we come to politics and public service to do. That's what ultimately matters. So in our case, we can take health, we can take education, we can take crime, we can take social welfare, and we're not getting the outcomes we want. But I was very, very impressed with, I've studied Singapore for a long time. And again, very effective public service, very aligned with the political class, but big investment in talented people that move around the system and build expertise. But very good measurement, very good performance reviews, very good accountability, things that I observed and had in place at Unilever or at Air New Zealand, very similar approach to how they sort of ran their public service. Not a business approach, but actually what are the principles of really great organisations, not good ones, great ones, whether they are government, whether they're community organisations or whether they're businesses being applied into that sector. So a lot more work for us to do, but targets, accountability, measurement. Yeah.
And before I go to another question in the audience, I mean, you mentioned your extensive commercial and private sector background, and one of the other questions that I think obviously the UK is wrestling with as we depart from the EU is overhauling our own regulatory environment. Something you mentioned as one of your sort of five pillars of your future policy. What areas do you think that you would prioritise in terms of, or what are the principles you would prioritise in terms of regulatory reform and making sure that you have an environment that is conducive to investment and business?
I mean, our big reform settings have sort of largely been completed in the economy, but where we have huge opportunities is in the micro economic business, pro-business sort of environment. Mm-hmm. So, we have things like national income insurance coming at us, we have things like national awards coming at us, we've had big increases in extending sick leave, minimum wages, more public holidays. So a lot of costs have been thrown, have been passed in government by government that has no people in it with any business experience, and it gets thrown over the fence, and actually those costs get passed on to businesses. And as a result, a lot of our New Zealand small businesses are not playing to win; they're kicking for touch because they actually have huge uncertainty about whether they can or should invest. So business confidence is at an all-time low since 1988. I think 62% of our businesses see the situation getting worse, not better. Consumer confidence is at record lows as well. So, what we need is just more consistent microeconomic reform around just unleashing enterprise, mm-hmm. Because we've kind of got into a place where the public look for the government for all their answers. But now businesses are getting soft and looking for the government for all their answers too, when in fact we want to have that entrepreneurship and that enterprise to be unleashed within New Zealand. So there's more to do. Why I went to Dublin was because obviously the Irish have done an exceptionally good job over the last 15, 20 years with respect to their trade and enterprise type body, which actually makes investments in their exporting firms so they can get those frontier firms out there in the world. We don't have that many globally scaled frontier firms. We have a lot of good domestic firms, as I said, in the top 10% that are more, 7 times more productive than the bottom 10%. But we struggle to get the big frontier firms that you see in other small advanced economies like New Zealand, like Denmark, that will have multiple firms that are globally scaled in the world. Ireland's the same now as well. And the problem with not having globally scaled frontier firms is that then we don't get the knowledge transfer coming back into our domestic firms. So, the Irish have done an exceptionally good job on attracting foreign direct investment, as you all know, but setting up the conditions to welcome those multinationals into their countries, which has then led to a whole ecosystem building in and around it. And it's not just, and I guess initially it was tax rates that were attractive, but it's much more than that now when you talk to those firms, as I have in the last couple of days, as to why they're coming there. So I think, New Zealand's done a lot of things well, and we're really proud about what we've done, but we need to go again, and we need to be much more enterprise-centric, because that's the lifeblood of actually what will enable us to lift our salaries and incomes. And when we raise incomes, it gives people more freedom and choice as to what they get to do with their life. So I want us to get much more into that pro-business, microeconomic reform.
Okay. I think there's a question, again, from another colleague at Policy Exchange.
Hi, Robert Donald.
G'day, mate.
Is this on? Yeah. Head of Economics at Policy Exchange. I guess I have two questions. My first is, I'm acutely conscious that one of the big problems that both the UK and the New Zealand economy is facing is rising house prices.
Yeah. And
house prices that might drive away or divert what would otherwise be productive investment into the real estate market. And I was just wondering what you didn't really touch on it in your speech, but I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that. And my second question is, as a Canadian, Canada's been trying to diversify away from the United States now for the better part of...
I lived there for 3 years.
Toronto. Oh, Toronto, nice.
Yeah.
Better part of 50 years, and we've only really been able to impact that on the margins. And I guess my question is, when it comes to diversifying New Zealand's exports, what does success look like? Like, what kind of, over the period of a parliament, 2 parliaments, what does success look like?
Yep. So, the first part on housing is that's been an abject failure for us, and it's been building over a period of time under successive governments. When you look at the 4 components of it, to give you a feel for it, just to ground you in reality, is home ownership has been falling, but the average house price has gone up over $400,000 to 1.1 million New Zealand dollars in the last 4 years. If you can't buy a house, you can go rent one, and our rents have gone up over $150 a week. So it's $7,500 more post-tax you've got to find to rent the same house you had today that you had 4 years ago. If you can't rent one, you end up then going to a state housing sort of situation, and our state housing wait list has now gone from 6,500 to I think 27,000, 4-fold increase in just 4 years. And then sadly, if you can't get a state house, you end up in emergency motel accommodation. And this morning, 4,500 kids woke up in New Zealand in motel accommodation, which was, not the ideal environment, with gangs and crime and other things in those environments. No wraparound services. So we've sort of got to go back to the beginning and sort of say, right, well, we have a country the same size as the United Kingdom with 5 million people in it. So it's a function of our own making, because resource consenting and unlocking the land has taken actually twice, that time has doubled over the last 10 years. And it's costing developers about $1.3 billion a year. And part of it is the way that we run local and central government in New Zealand. We have 67 district councils for 5 million people. We have a central government that essentially collects 90%, 94% of all the revenue. And actually, central government is really incented and gets from development, actually gets a lot of benefit and taxation benefit from it. Local government actually has to go spend money on the 3 waters, the pipes, the wiring, and actually then relies on a rating model in order to get its income back. So one is sort of disincented to do development, and one is incented to do development. So I think we need to reimagine what that could look like for New Zealand. So we actually have central and local government working together. And some of the work you did on Manchester deal, city deals, what the Australians then pushed on and did with regional deals or city deals as well, and really expanded that out. So you have both central and local government aligned on the critical infrastructure projects for the next 10 to 15 years that will make the biggest difference, I think, as a way forward. We need to do much better on help to buy schemes. We need to do much better on actually resource consenting and how we unblock some of those planning laws as we go forward. On the rental market, we've done something really silly in the last year. We ended up actually, despite the Inland Revenue Department saying don't do it, it's going to lead to higher rents. We removed what we call interest deductibility on rental properties, and interest, as a legitimate business cost. Our Prime Minister referred to it as a tax loophole. It's not a tax loophole, it's a legitimate business expense. But that has then added, coupled with what we call a bright line test, which has sort of been extended out to 10 years, has meant that that rental market has probably added another $50 a week in rent increases because of that. So you want to undo that. And for the first time in the next 10 to 20, 30 years, New Zealand will have domestic pools of capital, because our superannuation, our pension schemes which we haven't, have only low levels of contribution. But now they're sort of starting to add up, and we've got domestic pools of capital that could do things like build-to-rent programs, and obviously we want to have rent-to-buy programs down the road, and shared equity models would be really interesting to be exploring as well. So, and then on state housing, we've actually relied on the government to build a lot of state houses, which we should, and they should be foot to the accelerator full on. But it's an and, not an or. We should also be using community housing providers. So in New Zealand, people like the Salvation Armies or Māori trusts who are really close to those communities can actually build houses, and they just need access to capital to do so. So it should just be full on, getting our houses built. So those are the challenges that we kind of have, and how we're sort of looking at it. And what was the last question, mate? Diversification. Yeah, diversification. For me, it would be like, us being able to build market share in places like Southeast Asia, which for us is a logical place to us. I talked a bit about geographical isolation, but we've got to stop having our business people make excuses for why they can't compete and do well outside of New Zealand. We have a lovely business environment in New Zealand, but we have very limited success when our Kiwi firms go overseas to actually operate at scale. We've got great innovation and we've got awesome people and high creativity, but we're not converting commercially those businesses or those opportunities. So we've got to probably work harder, a bit like what I observed with Enterprise Ireland, in terms of how they build literacy, capability, to get people confident in places like Indonesia, where Australia, for example, has been in there since the late 80s. Big market, big opportunity for New Zealand. Yes, the margins might be different, but we've just got to get literacy and experience and capability happening in those places.
Okay, thank you. We've also got another question from a gentleman in our audience, and then there's one more remotely.
Good afternoon. Bernard Hogan Howe, a member of the House of Lords.
Hey,
they have a great unicameral system in New Zealand, by the way.
Yeah.
And previously Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police.
Oh, awesome.
The reason for being here is that within the last 2 years I spent about 6 weeks in New Zealand.
Yes.
Really enjoyed it. In fact, it's the only country in the world I think I would live in, other than this country.
We'd greatly take you. I mean, we took the best of Britain 200 years ago. We'll
Well,
take you again. Yeah.
It's in a great place. The reason for being there was to advise the Royal Commission on the Christchurch terrorist attacks.
Yes.
And there were many lessons to be learned from that. But
Yeah.
and they were taken. There were three big things for me. One was about firearms control.
Yes.
In a country of 5 million people, about 500,000 guns, and certainly for recent arrivals. I know that opportunity has been taken. There were two other areas. One was around the security service, was it punching above its weight, as the All Blacks do,
Yeah.
or was it punching below its weight? And I would argue it was punching below its weight. And a link to that on the back of some court cases, its ability to intrude into communications of those who would hurt you was on the back foot, not on the front foot.
Regulatory-wise, you felt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Partly partly leadership, but partly regulation.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, in the couple of years since that report was produced under Sir William Young, whether or not you thought progress had been made or more was to be done, because it's such a vital part, as you are, of
Yeah.
the Five Eyes system.
Yeah. No, look, I think, the first thing I'd say is that, the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Christchurch was a really good, it was a really solid report, really good report. It had, bipartisan support around what we needed to do there. We've moved too slowly in some aspects. I think we've got 7 of the 45-ish recommendations implemented. We've got about 30 in play, but some of the bigger ones, we need to really address those and start to get into those pretty quickly. That's certainly sort of something I think we could be accelerating a bit faster, but we're very aligned, I think, in both Labour and National parties around how to go about doing that. The second thing I'd say is around crime. It's interesting in New Zealand. We've sort of had violent, since you've probably been in the country, violent crimes up 21%. We've had a 45% growth in gang membership in New Zealand. So we have almost 8,000 gang members. We have 10,000 police officers. And that environment has changed quite a bit. It's become much more around organised crime, around the drug trade. And so we've been trying to argue for, yes, it's great that we've had good gun control around legal guns, but actually, and some of it's probably been, with respect to recreational shooters and sporting shooters, probably, we need to think about whether we've got that setting right. But the real challenges are legal guns that these gangs now have, and so we want to have firearm prohibition orders that enable warrantless search powers to be able to essentially harass gangs and to be able to do what we've seen work quite well in New South Wales, Queensland and Western Australia, where you've got those powers, because the illegal guns are the things that we've got to take off the streets. And so, but yeah, I'm interested in catching up with you a bit later on your observations on the broader intelligence stuff too.
Okay, before we wrap up, just there's another question online, and I'll ask you a final one as well. So Laura Burley asks, are there any other countries that you see as an example of using tech to increase productivity?
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, I mean, the one that I've, really the reason I want to go to Ireland after Singapore was Singapore's obviously done an exceptionally good job as well in digitising their economy. But Ireland, as I said, I think has done an exceptionally good job of just being able to move from being an agricultural and a tourism economy to one that now has double the amount of GDP per capita of New Zealand. Now, I appreciate the calculation with respect to those tech firms, would need some moderation, but either way you look at it, by jumping to and embracing technology and being able to attract billions of investment into their country and to create thousands of high-paying jobs, you can see the difference in there. So for me, that's the third big driver of prosperity for us. We have to really jump and embrace more technology. In New Zealand, in a business sense, we often tend to add labour to try and drive more productivity rather than actually investing in plant, capital and equipment and research and development to do so. So that's got to be a bit of a mind shift change, because sometimes we have this thing called the number 8 wire, which means we're very resourceful. We can do a lot of things with very little investment, but it just means sometimes we don't professionalise our businesses or get them to the next productivity curve. And that's been obvious over 30 years because we've been failing at this under successive governments for that period of time. So I think there are things, again, the microeconomic business reform that could encourage New Zealanders to embrace technology, New Zealand small medium enterprises to embrace more technology, and those are things that we're very interested in exploring more. But certainly Singapore, certainly Ireland, certainly the work that you've seen in Israel with respect to the way they do startups, the way that their ecosystem works between academia and government and business. Those are the ones that I've been always impressed with in the technology space.
Okay. And my final question, I guess, is, you mentioned that you're on a fact-finding mission. For those of us who might need some reassurance given the current political situation,
it's been interesting. It's been an interesting day to arrive in the UK. I've got to be honest with you. Yeah.
I mean, what is it that you are hoping to learn from us?
Well, I mean, really, I've been a big fan of the work of Catherine at Michaela School. A number of our think tank New Zealand Initiative, which I was a part of before I came to politics, and was a big supporter of. Was really impressed at some of her thinking around how do you get different education outcomes. And there you have an inner city school, pretty tough area, just around Wembley, and the way that she's built that school, as you well know, and I think many of you probably know her story, is pretty impressive. So education was really the focus here, because in many ways I felt that Britain had failing education over a period of time, and in more recent times there were pockets of things that you were doing to try and get better results. And again, as I say, in New Zealand, when you have 60% of your kids on average not having only making regular school attendance, 40% don't go to school regularly. When you say that to people in the UK or Ireland or Canada or the US, they can't quite believe that. And the worst thing is that actually in our bottom decile schools, particularly our bottom 3 deciles, we've only got 40% of our kids going to school regularly. So that's, as I said, it's not just a sort of a social failure or a moral failure, it's actually a future economic crisis, because how on earth are we supposed to jump to more productive businesses and higher value products and services and embrace technology if we can't get people educated? So really education is the focus of why I want to be here in the next couple of days.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our audience. Thank you to you for coming along to Policy Exchange, and please join me in thanking Christopher.
Thank you.